You're welcome. It's a pleasure to see you, Adenike.
Thank you so much for coming, Professor James Pascal van
Ypersele.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are all aware, and for some people that are not aware, about the just released IPCC report that was released this April 2022 that talks about mitigation of climate change. And this report gives us a global assessment of climate change mitigation processes and pledges, and as well examine the global emissions. It also explains the development of emission reduction and mitigation efforts in assessing national pledges, such as nationally determined contribution and other pledges that we have made, to see how far that we have been able to meet up with climate targets and able to solve the defining issue of our time. And today we have a very brilliant author that is once the former chair, vice chair of IPCC, that is going to be giving up a robust explanation of what this report tells us, because we have many of these reports that have been published and we don't have time. It is either we are able to reduce the emission or we are heading to a place of doom, of which we don't want that to happen. And so he's going to be telling us a brief about what he is doing, because we have had him as one of our guests before. So he's just going to tell us briefly about what the key report is trying to tell us about on the state of our planet and what we need to do in saving our planet from more danger. So thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Adenike. It's a pleasure to talk to you and to your viewers. So this report is about the solutions that are available to reduce the emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases which are disrupting the climate system and emphasizing heat waves and droughts and sea level rise, etc. And it's a report which explains the many options, the many choices that we can make if we want to reduce those emissions which disrupt the climate system. Because that's really needed, because we are still seeing an increase of global emissions. The emissions curves has not started to peak yet. It's still increasing, which is bad news for climate, because it means that we are still emitting way more greenhouse gases than what natural systems can absorb. And therefore, it means that the insulating layer, the thermal insulating layer that we are installing around the planet is increasing and increasing and increasing. And that is really changing the climate of this planet, which is the only inhabitable planet in the solar system. So we better take care of it if we want to keep it livable for ourselves, but also for all living species in the future. It explains that the good news is that many of those options which would allow replacing coal, oil, and gas, which are really at the source of CO2 emissions, the main human greenhouse gas, many of those options to replace them, like solar energy, solar photovoltaics, wind energy, that those techniques have seen their costs being reduced enormously over the last 10 years. So that's good news, because it means that the transition to a cleaner way to produce energy will be easier, because those techniques become much cheaper. There's another key message in this report, and that's the fact that to address climate change, we not only need to look at the way to produce energy in a cleaner way than by burning fossil fuels, but we also need to work hard to be more efficient with energy. because there's a lot of wastage of energy in the world, particularly in developed countries, which have been using a disproportional fraction of the energy that's used in the world. I mean, there's a number which is very striking in this report, and that is that the 10% which are the richest in the world emit almost 1/2 of the global CO2 emissions. So in terms of responsibility, it's clear that those who have a lot of revenue, mostly, not only, but mostly in developed countries, have a particular responsibility to reduce their emissions. And one key way the emissions can be reduced beyond producing the energy in a cleaner way, as I said, is to reduce the wastage, is to increase the energy efficiency, is to maybe do some changes in one's lifestyle. Instead of flying a lot, like some people in developed countries do a lot, taking flights many times a year for no reason sometimes, or just for holidays. If we try to reduce those habits which are linked to a very high level of resource consumption and energy consumption, we can also reduce the emissions that are associated to those habits. So this report has a full chapter, chapter 5 in the report, which is available on the IPCC website, ipcc.ch. There's a full chapter devoted to the energy demands and the way well-being can be delivered to everyone in the world, including to those who still have difficulty today to have access to energy. In many parts of the developing world, that is the case. It is possible to address those needs while being much more efficient with energy and reducing actually the global energy demands. Because the cleanest of all energy is the energy that's not used. And once that is done, it's possible then to address the second question, which is how to produce in the cleanest way the energy that we still need. So these are two of the key messages that can be found in this report.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for that elaborate view of what it is in the report, because not everybody will be able to read all of those reports, you know, but thank you for breaking it down, giving us a summary of what it entails. And the next question is talking about, because they mentioned about pledges and whole. And what baffles me most is when we see leaders that talks about carbon neutrality by 2050, 2060, 2070 or thereabouts. And then I look at it, how visible is this pledges when we have the Paris Agreement that is somehow not bind or not compulsory, you know, whereby any country could just check out at any point in time that it thinks it's not comfortable about the agreement. Because I feel at a point, all of this agreement should be necessary. It's not a voluntary thing, because now the climate action have shown that it's a global issue. It's affecting every country in different ways. And so how do you rate our pledges, the policies and everything put in place? Do you think it's something that will be able to meet up with the current target of halving our emission by 2030 or less than 2030, meeting up our current target, or we need to upgrade our policies, or there's something we need to do different that we're not doing right now?
Thank you. It's a very good question. It's also an issue that's addressed in this report. And there is both good news and bad news. The good news is that the efforts that have been made up to now, the climate policies that have been implemented up to now, have started to at least dent the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions. And it seems that the probability of reaching the highest scenarios, which were discussed a few years ago, including in the previous IPCC report, have a lower probability of being reached. And that's good news, because the highest scenario were really representing a catastrophe in terms of inhabitability of the planet. So the first step has been done, and that's good news, and it's a step in the right direction. That's the good news. The bad news is that that first step is far from being sufficient. With the present NDCs, as they are called, the national plans that countries have submitted, have announced in the framework of the Paris Agreement, we would probably, if there is no further rise in ambition, we would probably reach by the end of the century somewhere around 3 degrees, maybe even 3.5 degrees more than the pre-industrial value. That's a lot more than the most ambitious and safest target of the Paris Agreement, which would be to avoid crossing the 1.5 degree C limits above the pre-industrial value. So there is both good news and bad news, and the bad news means that humanity still has to raise its ambition level. It means that before the next COP27 in Egypt, countries need to, as much as possible, raise the bar, raise the ambition level, and announce policies and implement policies. That's even more important than just announcing them, that would reduce emissions more than what has been announced or implemented up to now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So if I could get you clearly, that means the current policies or pledges is not equal to the amount of the reality of the climate change crisis. That means we need to brace up all of these things. And just the next question, talking about this report talks about different sectors in the economy and not limited to the environment sectors. That tells us that the climate crisis is now, all our sectors are now climate sensitive, and then we need to look for climate smart approach in dealing with all of this crisis. And so I just want to ask, because while I was reading the report, I came across carbon budgets, and I think I'm not the only one that is confused when we talk about it, because we have the Earth overshoot that tells us about the particular time in the year whereby we have used all what we should have used, for the entire year, and it just elapsed, and then we are stealing into the future of the next generation. So I just want to know more about this carbon budget. I know it's going to help other people to understand it because it was part of the report. Is it something that we have exhausted or something we are about to exhaust, or what does it have to do with this emission and the rest? Because of course we cannot adapt to the climate change crisis why emissions keep rising. So we have, in as much as we are adapting, we are trying to mitigate at the same time so as to balance the equation. So I would like to know about that carbon budget from your angle and the reports that was released.
Yes, I'll try to explain that, because it's true that it's not such an easy matter. So you know that when CO2 in particular, which is the main human greenhouse gas, when CO2 is emitted in the atmosphere, it traps heat in the system and it contributes to a rise in temperature. I think everybody, even in primary school, is starting to know that. Now, there is a relationship which is actually very simple, and which basically says the more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, in other words, the thicker the CO2 thermal insulation layer is around our planet, the warmer it will be under that insulating layer. So there's a relationship between the total amount of CO2 present in the atmosphere and the temperature increase, okay? And if, let's make the numbers simple. If you look at the total amount of CO2 that can be emitted since the start of the Industrial Revolution in developed countries in the 18th century, until the point when approximately the 1.5 degrees C warming level has been reached, that total amount is, if I remember well, because I don't have my papers in front of me, approximately 3,000 billion tons of CO2, or a little less than 3,000 billion tons of CO2, okay? Now, the problem is that we have emitted way more than 2,000 billion tons of CO2 already. Again, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's the order of magnitude. What is called the remaining carbon budget is the difference between 3,000, the total maximum amount that we can emit if we don't want to overshoot the 1.5 degrees C limit, and what we have emitted already, those 2,000 gigatons we have emitted already. So, you know, that remaining carbon budget is exactly that. It's the remaining amount of CO2 that can be emitted. And again, I don't have my papers in front of me, but it's somewhere between 500 gigatons and 1,000 gigatons, depending on the exact temperature level you are ready to accept in terms of warming. It's closer to 1,000 if you accept 2 degrees. It's closer to 500 gigatons if you want to target 1.5 degrees C warming as a limit. So that's what the carbon budget is, the remaining carbon budget. Now let's take the lower number, 500 gigatons of CO2, which is the number that is approximately valid for the 1.5 degree C limit, and compare it to the amount that is emitted every year. And every year, humanity today emits approximately, let's say, 50,000, 50 gigatons of CO2. So it means 50 billion tons of CO2. So if the remaining carbon budget is 500, and if we emit every year 50, it means that remaining carbon budget, if we were staying at the present emission level, would be empty in 10 years. Okay, so that's the where the urgency of the action comes from, because that carbon budget, that the remaining carbon budget is dwindling very fast. And if we use all of it, it means automatically that we will overshoot the temperature limit we're trying to avoid. And as you said, Adenike, it means that adaptation will become much more difficult. So we really have to try to remain within that remaining carbon budget if we want to respect the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thank you.
That was
Yeah,
clear.
yeah, very well, very well. You know, you just simplified it, and I get along with what you have just said. You know, from all your explanation, it made me to know more, and I know that my audience will also follow suit to understand better about what they talk about carbon budgets. That at this level at which we are currently, the bulk of the emission lies in the energy sector, which was mentioned about talking about fossil fuel, the need for us to phase it out, because if we don't, then there's a big issue. If we keep emitting and then we are trying to adapt, it's difficult, just as you just mentioned. And just a concluding question that I'm going to ask, talking about emission, that has to do with renewable energy revolution, because we talked about the industrial revolution, but of course we need a renewable energy revolution, because this is a way that we can use to tackle the bulk of the climate change crisis, to prevent further crisis, because we have not yet hit that 1.5 degrees of warming yet, and the whole earth is become inhabitable. Then now imagine if we then hit that 1.5 degrees, it becomes a very big issue towards humanity, biodiversity and the rest. And so I just want you to quickly explain to us, as a concluding statement from you, about what you think about the transition process. And we also help to increase prosperity for individual countries, because I know for some country that might think phasing out fossil fuel is going to affect their development or something. So how do we transit? How do we move away from this unsustainable energy source to a cleaner, renewable sources of energy that could help every country to grow faster, you know, to beat down emissions as quick as possible?
Okay, it's a very good question. And the answer is not that simple. It's tricky. But there are solutions. That's the good news.
Mm-hmm.
First, I'd like to say that the issue of the need to allow and increase energy access for all on this planet is also at the core of this report. So it is not as if this report was saying we need to reduce emissions everywhere. That's not what the report says. This report by IPCC clearly recognizes that there are about 1 billion people on this planet who unfortunately don't have yet access to important energy services like electricity, for example, and that kind of easy to use energy. But the report says that satisfying those basic needs, those basic human needs in the world for all, for everybody on this planet, would actually have a minimal effect on global emissions. And that's the reason for that, is that the bulk of the emissions are coming from the richest, wherever they are, mostly in developed countries, but not only. And it is not, is there, okay. Should I start again? Because it was cut in the middle of a
Please.
sentence.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry. Thank you.
So the good news is that because, as I said at the beginning, the cost of many clean energy technologies has decreased fast and continues to decrease, it will be possible to provide the world, the entire world, including those who don't have energy access today, with cleaner forms of energy, particularly if there are transfers of funds, of technology, of knowledge from north to south, as what developed countries have promised already in Copenhagen in 2009, to transfer $100 billion per year starting from 2020 from developed to developing countries. And that's a target which has not been reached yet. And of course, the transition of the entire world, including developing countries, towards the actually enabling conditions were shared in a much more equitable way. So that's really one of the challenges of COP27, and we will see in November whether developed countries respect their pledges to help developing countries, because it's only together, developed countries and developing countries working together, that we can fix this climate problem.
Thank you so much. It's really, really an enriching section today with you, talking about the IPCC report. You know, we could go on, and I know you could explain more and more of the chapters and all. But then I know you have contributed greatly to this discussion. And then I know you have been doing great things. And I met you at COP26, and through there I got to meet Princess. And so a lot of things they have been doing for young people and different people in your space. And I think I give you kudos for that. Thank you so much for coming, for honoring my invitation, always being flexible with your schedules, because I reached out and I know that it's been a busy day for you, but then you are able to accept the invitation. Thank you so very much. And I know the IPCC. Okay. Thank you. And I know the IPCC report keeps giving us warning. Just imagine if we don't have such a report that keeps giving us warning, what would have happened to the world? You know, we would have not been able to get this kind of action that we are getting. But because such reports keep giving leaders time that we don't have time to waste. We have to act now because of different crises that is happening. So thank you so much to you and your team for working hard. You know, it's not easy to bring up an holistic thousands of reports. You know, it's a whole lot of work done in there. And so that is why we need to act. That is why we need to appreciate them through our actions, and moving from the talking phase to the action phase to see how we can bridge up action that is needed in tackling the climate change crisis. Thank you so much for coming. Maybe you have a final word for this section, then we go.
Well, you know, it's you thanked the IPCC for its work, but I would like to thank you and all the youth in the world who are pushing actually policymakers to act more, because it's very important. You know, as I often say, it's easy to put a new IPCC report in a drawer for a policymaker. It's easy to do that, particularly after having one's picture taken in front of the media with that IPCC report. It's much harder to put the side of a youth talking to a policymaker and asking him or her, what are you doing with my future? And that you cannot put in a drawer as easily as an IPCC report. So your role is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Thank you for coming.